welcome to the Data Vault Friday. My name is Michael Olschimke. I'm the CEO of Scalefree. We have this session here every Friday, 11 o'clock Central European Standard Time, to allow you, the audience, to ask questions essentially about Data Vault 2.0, cloud computing, anything MP relevant, anything data driven, AI driven as well. It's all good essentially. You can use the chat here in the client. You can use the Q&A functionality in the client if you want to raise some questions. You can also raise your hand virtually. I don't see it if we just raise it in front of your webcam. But I would essentially give you a voice, and you can ask a live question if you want. I can also show you a form afterwards today, where you can essentially upload your question, maybe upload some diagrams if you want, some images if you want, and use that essentially for submitting a question essentially. That allows me to create some slides, which I've done today as well. If we receive multiple questions, we would cherry pick. If there would be no questions at all, and we're getting closer to this point, I will talk about the cluster here. So better ask questions because I didn't have much time to play around with this cluster. All right, so we received one question. Let me just show it to you 1 second. There you are. Yeah. Okay. So this is about the data dimension. And you know it from legacy data warehousing, we typically have a data dimension, and typically it's in the dimension model. I mean, it's star schema, snowflake schema. You have some. We initially had, or back then we had a table with all the dates and their descriptions essentially, and that's being used then by other entities. And that's all about this here. So essentially, so they get data with a date or timestamp, let's say, or some date from the source, and they want to use a time dimension for these fields essentially. So first of all, what I would look at also is what the capabilities of the dashboarding or of the reporting solution are, because they also have sometimes a capability of producing or interpreting a timestamp or date for presentation purposes. So that's one thing. But let's say we want to model this in Data Vault or in the backend. So how do we do this? A couple of options here. One would be to create something in the raw Data Vault, a hub link satellite construct, maybe a time hub or date hub, and referencing that from other hubs, let's say maybe from non-histors link with purchases, using a link, maybe a non-histors link referring to a date, right? But then you would also hash it, right? So you would hash the date essentially. Or as a time reference table, and then joining that in the information mart. Should the time dimension hold a hash key as a dimension key for that, or the business key, the date itself? Or both options, or something else, right? So let's go through them. The first one here, the thing is this: a date or timestamp, for that matter, is typically not a good candidate for a business key, because the date is changing every day, right? So even a opening day of the bank account, well, on every day, on every business day, there will be people opening a bank account. That's a problem, right? And the issue is with having dates in the hub is that the date leads to a non-integrating hub, because you get a lot of keys on a certain day, some other keys on another day. Even if you refer to some key on the next day, on the same day, on this a key that you already have from a previous business day, the problem is these business keys spread across the timeline now. And these business keys don't integrate above the 1 day anymore. And that's the issue. So having a date in a hub typically tends to become a relatively large hub essentially, with a lot of data records in there, data records, and non-integrating let's say non-integrating behavior. So just having said that, might be different for a data dimension or dates hub, let's say. But still, what I would do is this, or what we also recommend in the book, but also what we do in the training. We typically create some reference table for the date. Let me just draw it up for you guys. How we model this. In the most simple case, let's start with that one, right? So not what we do anymore, but in the most simple case, and it's as printed in the book essentially, we create a flat and white table. So we have a integer-based version of the date. So let's say we have today is 2024. This would be the code essentially, or the date. It's 12, okay. 0112. That will be essentially today's date. And then you get all the descriptions. Well, it's what caption, for example. It's the Data Vault Friday, so DV Friday. I mean, you could print anything you want, right? Then this maybe the day of months would be 12. Day of year, don't ask. Oh, that's actually quite simple, actually. Day of year is 12, and so on, right? So that's essentially the ID for the flat and white structure. And then in your data, you have a reference to a date. So there would be a, essentially, let's say, a date type column. What I would do is I would also add the date data type as well. So I have the, the 4 bytes, I believe it is, 4 byte date data type. And just for joining purposes. Because in my source data, as it comes from the source system, in my satellite, there will be a date column, a column with a data type of type date. So I want to join with that quickly into my reference table. Sometimes I don't have a code, essentially, an integer-based code. So I'm using that one to join into this table and then to retrieve everything I need to have, or to refer to the dimension, and then the dimension, the dashboard tool will deal with the rest later, essentially. So that's my recommendation number 1. Now, what we do is typically these days, we create what we call a reference hub and a reference satellite, because we want to keep track of changes here. What if you modify the, let's say, the caption here, and you say, well, let's remove DV and from this caption, just call it Friday. The problem is in this scenario is you have to run an update. So you have to run an update to get rid of the DV here. And that's a challenge. So what we typically do is we create a reference hub, and the reference hub, ref hub date, only contains the days. So in this case, I would just keep the integer value still, most probably. So 2024 01 12, 2024 01 13, and so on. That's my reference hub. And yes, there might be some other data in it, like the maybe a load date sometimes or record source, but no hash key. There's no hash key in here. You keep the original code. And then you create what we call a reference satellite for date or calendar sometimes. And this one here, essentially, the reference satellite, any reference satellite, not just date one, any reference satellite has more or less the same structure as a standard satellite in a raw data vault. However, we don't have a hash key involved here. So we use the code instead of the hash key for the primary key. So we have the code from the parent, the load date timestamp, and then the descriptions that you want to keep track of when they change over time. It's not that often in a daytime dimension, right? They don't change that much. But what if you translate it, for example, or what if you want to change the colors of the dates and so on, right? There might be some reason why you want to keep track of changes, and you see one in 1 second. So I add the caption. I add, what did you add? The of months, date of year, oh gosh, and the date column itself. So then I have essentially more or less the same table as up there. 12, 2024, 01, 13, day one, Friday, Saturday. Yeah, okay, the writing is not that best, right? Okay, so that's the idea. 12, 13, 12, 13, it's easy, and so on. Okay, that's the reference satellite. Now, I mean, for now, it's like a bit of overkill. You could even argue the dates don't change. So why don't we just create a flat and white table for that, right? What I would not do anymore is, as in the book, we create a master data table in MDS. And this table became very large and very hard to maintain in MDS in the first place. And then you had to copy it over to the data warehouse. And nobody was modifying it. I mean, it failed the purpose of MDS to be able to modify these records, essentially, right? What you would do is contract types and all the other reference data. You want to modify them, and you want to leave it to the business to modify them. But for the dates, I mean, you could have a table with all the names of the dates, Monday to Sunday. You could have something for the month names and so on, right? Or maybe some parameters from when to when you want to create this daytime dimension. That's what I would create in the in your MDM solution. But other than that, it would just calculate the values and afterwards. So that's the using SQL functions, essentially. All right. And you don't even modify this table, right? So I mean, maybe your successors in 1,000 years, when they hit the limit of your setup, they will have to extend the table then. Okay, that's their problem, not yours. All right. Okay, so this is essentially capturing the calendar date. But what about the fiscal date? Let's make it a bit more interesting for you guys now. What about the fiscal date? The thing is this. Every day, so for example, the 12th of January 2024, in our case, is on the same fiscal day. So it's still in the first fiscal quarter in our case at Scalefree. It's still in the fiscal year of 2024 and so on. But what if you have a shift? What if you're in retail, for example, and your fiscal year starts on the 1st of March or April or something, and ends at the end of March, when essentially the Christmas returns are over. Essentially, that's when they start the fiscal year. So in this case, the idea now is to use this reference satellite for this purpose. And what we often do is we create a flat and white table for the dates, because we just realize, well, they don't change. If you need to translate them, there's some other tricks essentially, like if you want to translate the weekdays and so on. But we typically create a reference table for the dates, just to keep it simple and simple to use, right? That's the one. And then we create a reference satellite for the fiscal year. So a reference, because you can combine it, right? There's nothing against having a reference table flat and white, and then you explain the code, the integer value of the date, using a satellite. And we call this the reference satellite fiscal calendar. Again, structure-wise, you are on the code, you are on the load date timestamp. That's your primary key here, the first two columns. And then you explain what this day means in the fiscal calendar. So for example, you have essentially 2024, 01/12, day 1 loading. That's a D, sorry. And then you say, okay, fiscal quarter, fiscal year, and so on, fiscal day, whatever. So fiscal quarter, this would be the 4th quarter of the fiscal year 2023, if we're still in the previous year. We didn't close the book yet. And so on, right? So it would be the fiscal day of the quarter, to make it easy for me, the 12th, and so on. And then you have 2012, 01, 013, D1, 4, 2023, 13. Now, what if you're getting, so that's the idea. So we have one flat and white table where you essentially have the dates essentially described, and then you create a reference satellite for the fiscal calendar. You could even have both. So you could also say, you know what, I want to keep track of changes. So I'm not creating this one here. What I'm doing is I'm creating the reference hub with all the dates, and one satellite for the standard calendar, and one satellite for the fiscal calendar. Nothing against it, right? But what if you're getting taken over by another company and they're not on your fiscal calendar? Well, I don't want to say the loser, but the acquired company gets essentially then rearranged on the fiscal calendar, maybe. So you would at least want to have the flexibility of being able to modify your fiscal calendar over time, right? Because it might happen. It's always a pain of, it's a lot of work, but not for you, right? It's more or less an operation problem, not yours. Because what we do is quite simple. We just add a new set of deltas into the fiscal calendar here, into this reference satellite for the fiscal calendar. So when you say, you know what, let's align it to the corporation decides to align your fiscal calendar, which used to start on the 1st of April every year. They want to realign this now to the 1st of January. So be it. What you do is you create a new perspective on the same date in the fiscal calendar. So I'm just adding additional data records here to this fiscal calendar satellite, essentially explaining the same date, 2024, 01, 12, day 2, because we're going to change. So it's in the fiscal quarter now of 1. It's in the fiscal year of 2024, and still the 12th day of the quarter, and so on. So that's how we can keep track of changes to the fiscal calendar, and then it depends on how you query the data. The data itself didn't change. The transaction still happened on the 12th of January 2024. So be it. How you interpret this now depends on how you select the data based on a load date, essentially, or which fiscal calendar you want to apply, the previous one or the next one, essentially. And then you essentially apply the same concepts as you would essentially select deltas on a satellite. You go for the most recent description, and this morning it was essentially the description of today's date. So the second batch, essentially, of day 2, essentially. And for the yesterday's perspective, you apply yesterday's perspective. So here's one question from Gregor. do you join the reference satellite directly in information mart, or do you create a dimension out of that reference satellite, and how would that look like? I go for the first option. So typically, you just describe your codes, your contract types, your dates, your shifts, your timestamps, right? You could also do the same for hours of the day, right? You describe all these, and then the problem is the source system will still deliver data as it's being delivered. Maybe a date type, maybe a timestamp, maybe some integer-based date, maybe a text-based description. I don't know, right? So what you do is you just keep the data as it's being delivered in a raw data vault in a satellite. You just keep it as is, as it's being delivered from the source. So if it delivers a date, so be it. And then when you produce your dimensions, what you do is you create essentially so let's say you have a non-historized link for that matter. You have a non-historized link that refers to, let's say, the date here in this case. So I have a non-historized, let's say payments, whatever it is, tax payments, or I don't know. And then you have, let's say, a TID here, the customer hash key, CHK, and some value and some date. And let's say that's your date type. That's a column of type date. All right. So X. So what we do is this. We create a fact entity. The fact entity, let me just I use red, not for, yeah. So I create a fact entity out of this table, more or less. I'm simplifying here a bit, to be honest, but that's what it is. So I'm creating a fact entity for payments. But then I typically, in my dimension model or in the dimension models of our customers, they typically don't want to use a date for the joining purposes. They want to use the integer value of the date essentially often, which is fine. So, but just keep this in mind. So what we do is now we create a dimension. Let's say a calendar dimension, not a physical calendar. I want to simplify it again. So I'm creating a calendar dimension based on the data I have in the raw data vault, the reference tables essentially. What I'm doing is I'm creating a dimension like this. This is how I join this. I select everything from the reference hub, join the reference setter for the descriptions, and that gives me my flat and white structure. The code, the integer value, and all the descriptions, including the date. That's the basic idea. Now, the problem is the join condition here between the dimension and the fact. The fact uses a date, and the dimension is using integer value for the code. Well, for that, to simplify that, what I would do is, in my fact entity, I would replace the date data type by the integer value, essentially by joining from when I produce my fact view on top of the payments table, I'm joining from here with this X value in here to retrieve this value and move this one into here as a replacement for the date. So then I have my star schema, which is based on integer values, at least for the code, and hash keys for your customers and products and what else. But for the reference data, we join by code. We don't hash it, we just join by code. The idea is quite simple. Why we use codes for reference data? First of all, it's a very small data set. And second, the codes are typically very short and fixed lengths. So adding or creating a hash out of your codes wouldn't bring you any value. You don't change the problem or you don't fix a problem of having variable length business keys and turn this into fixed length business keys or hash keys. You don't have that problem. Hash keys are much longer. We use them in a typical data model because you have combination of different business keys, and the combination of 2, 3, 4, 5 business keys, they become quite simple and quite fast, larger than the 32 characters of a MD5 expressed as a character string, essentially. That's the basic ideas. So that's what we do essentially. So we use we just pre-join the code for the reference table, for the reference dimension, if you want, into your facts. So you have a star schema-based system. I mean, yeah, it simplifies the joins in most tools. Some tools are looking for integer-based keys, right, or string-based keys. They would ignore the date time or the date column here as a join condition potentially. So that's the risk essentially. All right. So yeah, and Richard, yes, the only correct data vault answer is it depends. It's also true to some extent, but that's how we typically model it in the information mart based on your data. All right, cool. Sorry for splitting up everything here. Very chaotic. But that's what it is. It's actually very, very relatively simple and straightforward topic essentially. All right, cool. So thanks for joining me. Let me get back to my slides. Yeah, so we would essentially model it as a reference table and then simplify the codes. And the thing is this, the dashboarding tool that you use for consuming the information mart, that would then resolve your codes against the dimensions essentially. And the trick I showed you It's also the same trick that we use when you have in your data sets, when you have different ISO codes, let's say ISO 2 codes, ISO 3 codes for countries and languages, but you want to standardize on those codes in your information mass. There should be always ISO 3 code, no matter what the source system is delivering. Well, in this case, just replace it by pre-joining the right code into your facts and then referring to the primary key of your dimensions, essentially. That's the basic idea. All right, it's all done in information mart, typically, except if you need the right codes for your business logic. If you need to apply something in the business vault, and depending on the code of the country, you want to apply something else, some other factor, then you might have to replace the codes in your business vault entities as well. That's another story. All right. Cool. If you have a question like this, check out this form here at sfr.ee/dbfriday. That's where you can upload your questions. That's where you can essentially upload some pictures of the whiteboard, maybe some images, or some drawings in Visio or any other of your favorite drawing tools. Also check out our other webinars on DBT and RESTscape. That's at scalefree.to/webinars. They're once a month. That's why they're not called DV or RESTscape Friday or something. But yeah, it's still a cool session. And if you have any questions in the meantime, we essentially teamed up with Ignition Data in Australia. That's DVA's partner in Australia, and came up with the Innovators community where you can essentially ask your questions. Our people are essentially answering your questions there for free. It's all free. We set up or we upload our marketing material as well, like white papers, success stories, and so on. Some videos they also show up there. So check it out. It's a really cool platform essentially for you guys, for the community essentially to get some help essentially. All right, cool. So enjoy the weekend. Hope to see more questions. I'm running short a bit, so shoot more questions if you want. And hope to see you next Friday. Thank you, guys. Thanks for joining today. If you'd like to discuss this further, give us a call on the number below here, and we're happy to discuss this with you. See you next time. Have a nice weekend. Bye-bye.